welcome to the Metcast Crypto Corner, brought to you by Naavik. I'm your host, Niko Vuori. Today's episode isn't strictly about Web3 gaming, but is instead dedicated to the broader topic of staying on top of understanding Web3 trends. For anyone who's involved in Web3, you will appreciate how lightning fast the entire space moves. Every single day, there is some major new development. Every week, there is some new NFT project that comes along and captures a huge amount of mindshare, huge amounts of trading volume. And every month, whatever the prevailing meta is totally upended, and the rules of the game get rewritten by the next hotness. So what we thought was a reasonably fundamental truth just a short while ago is now woefully outdated. And this is true for everyone working and building in Web3, whether you're making games or you're an NFT project or you're doing DeFi, regardless of vertical. And that is why I wanted to bring our two guests onto the pod today. My guests today are both independent analysts who cover the Web3 space. They both write Substack newsletters, which are both excellent, illuminating, insightful in their own ways, but they are very different. And this is why I love having them on the show together today. They do have a shared goal, which is to stay on top of Web3 trends, understand what's going on, share with an audience, hey, what the heck am I doing here in this space? And so I'm really excited to have them on the show so we can glean some insights about their work and how they work to understand this space and share that with our listenership today. So our first guest today is Thomas Pan. He writes a daily newsletter called TPan on Web3, which provides, in my opinion at least, a fun and entertaining analysis of what is driving the Web3 trends and news of the day. TPan, welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Niko. Excited to be here. Excited to share, what I'm learning, what I know, which isn't that much more than everyone else, and share my process and what the hell is going on in this space.
Awesome. Well, great to have you here. Our second guest, Chris Sotraidis. I'm sorry, I should have asked your pronunciation. Hopefully, I didn't massacre it too badly. He writes a newsletter called Spatial Awareness, which is less frequent than TPan's, but it goes really deep on topics, especially as it relates to established brands from Web 2 coming into Web 3 and building in that space, innovating in that space. Chris, welcome to the pod.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Excited to talk more about all the topics we have lined up for tonight.
Awesome. Great. Well, the first question I have for both of you, I'm going to start with TPan, is how did you get into the Substack newsletter business, and why and how did you get into Web3? What made you decide to cover this crazy space that we all operate in?
Yeah, great question. I think, a lot of folks who've joined this space over the past couple of years have similar yet different stories. So what I mean by that, I'll just share how I got in here. I first learned and bought my first NFT in January 2021, like literally hundreds of thousands of others. I joined through NBA Top Shot by Dapper Labs. Great company, great strategy, great products. And honestly, I came for the money and I stayed for everything else. I don't think I am profitable from a Top Shot perspective, but what I realized was, as a growth guy, I've had a decade of experience in Web 2 marketing and growth related roles at large startups, at small startups. Niko, we've crossed paths, of course. I realized that there's something going on here from more of a qualitative and quantitative standpoint that fascinated me. So after Top Shot, I just continued to dive into the niche of the NFT space within Web3. And I was fascinated with the community, the culture, the creator aspects of what was going on. And that sort of led me to the broader Web3 space. And when I share my story, and similar to many others, it got to a point where my behavior completely changed. And what I mean by that was I used to consume a lot of my social media on Instagram, primarily memes, catching up with friends, the DMs, all that fun stuff. And that changed in a wholesale manner. I started to only be on Twitter and Discord and just lurk like crazy. All my non-sleeping, all my non-working hours were on those platforms. I just started to just follow different folks. And I got to a point where I realized, why not be a little bit more serious about this not an interest, not a hobby, but a passion of sorts. And that comes by pretty rarely. I think a lot of people are interested in a lot of things, but it really gets to a different degree when you realize you have a passion about something. So I decided to initially take a sabbatical from my full-time job to do two things. One was connect with a lot more people in the Web3 space. Chris is one of them. I'm grateful to have met him early on in my journey. And the second was to itch the scratch of writing. I've always been curious and wanted to write outside of, prior to April this year, I literally only wrote one public piece. And that was actually being laid off 5 years ago, which fortunately people on LinkedIn found helpful and useful. And I just thought there's something more, but I didn't quite have the right topic or the right mental or emotional space to do it. Lo and behold, being on sabbatical helps a lot. So I thought I was going to write once or twice a week. And literally the next week, I started realizing I want to write every day. So I've been writing 5 times a week, or almost 5 times a week if I'm traveling. There might be exceptions, but 5 times a week for 6 months straight. So yesterday was number 123. Today will be 124. I'll start writing after this podcast.
Awesome. I have to say, I've really enjoyed your writing. I think I probably read your very first edition, or certainly got started very early on. And I don't think it's unfair or exaggerated to say that there aren't that many insightful writers for Web3, because it's a very fast moving space, as I said in my intro. And so I definitely have appreciated your writing. You don't exclusively write about games, and neither does Chris, but I thought that because the space moves so fast and there's so many learnings from the broader culture and community of Web3. You mentioned, hey, I'm now on Twitter exclusively. I'm now on Discord. Like, I found myself doing the same journey. Obviously I'm not writing about Web3. I'm trying to build games and trying to cover the space through this podcast. But it's been a really interesting, similar journey. I hear this a lot where it's like, okay, what I was doing before I got into Web3 and got red-pilled is quite different to what I'm doing now. And that's something that is, to your point, TPan, it's quite rare. It doesn't happen that often, that something that significant happens where you're like, oh, wow, like this is a passion of mine. I'm now like truly red-pilled into this space. I'm buying NFTs. I've got a monkey as my profile picture, like this. And I say that with some jest, but it's actually a really powerful and meaningful thing once you actually get into that space. So when you speak about the journey, and our listeners hopefully will share, some of them will share this, or some of them will at least appreciate how unique it is to have these types of experiences. They don't come very often. So anyway, thank you very much for sharing that journey. Chris, same question for you. What was your journey into Web3? How did you become a Substack newsletter writer? And, what is driving your idea of what to cover? Because again, your coverage is quite different to what TPan's is. And by the way, listeners, all of the links to Chris's and TPan's newsletters, Substacks, will be in the show notes. So don't worry, we'll link out to all of those. I endorse them. I find them useful, and hopefully you will too. So Chris, take it away. What's your journey into Web3?
Yeah, it's very similar to Thomas's. We got in around the same time, maybe for different reasons. I had been aware of Bitcoin and had been using it, but the thing that I hadn't really taken note of was the culture that was surrounding or starting to surround Ethereum-based projects and Web3 at large. So it had taken some time for me in like last summer, a lot of digestion over the first year of really being in the space. So my suggestion for anyone starting to write is like, you can really only write something meaningful if you have, kind of gathered enough information internally. And it was completely by mistake too. I had loved writing, my entire life and into working at a few other different software startups, but I knew something was different about it in ways that I at first couldn't fully articulate. And as time had gone on, it was like the clouds kind of like dissipated and I was able to make a better discernment as to like what to focus on and what to care about. So, as far as like deciding on what to write on, we'll definitely get into that more. But what's really kind of forged my path is just what is interesting at the moment and what is different, and like slowing down with information and being able to like have a level of discernment where you're able to like recognize like, oh, this is more important. This is not more important. And even with like the recent changes in the market, seeing how, and we'll get into this later with some of the changes for like creator royalties, for example, that things change, and nothing is static, but there are techniques and ways to try to stay on top of stuff. And none of us on the call can say that we're like 100% engaged. It's impossible, but there are techniques and ways to stay on top of stuff. Talking to smart people is definitely one of the best ways. So getting into writing, complete accident. Starting with Substack was largely at TPan's kind of suggestion, because I knew I had been using Mirror and I didn't want to use Medium because it just seemed way too cliche. And I felt like Substack had a lot of the features that I was looking for as a writer, and moving into like adding mixed media content down the line, like, appearing on podcasts, starting your own, or doing video stuff, because, not everyone's going to be engaged to read a 5,000 word essay. You have to recognize that I'm not just writing for the audience. I'm also writing for myself to learn. It helps for, I just felt like that was the easiest way for me to learn. And then as time went on, formulating ideas in a way that made sense for me really helped for, translating that to other people. It just made everything a lot easier. So that's what's been up in the last year in a nutshell.
Awesome. I have the first kind of core question I have for you guys, and then we are going to talk about creator royalties next, because that's the hotness. And again, it's very timely and topical. Things move like a million miles an hour, and suddenly that's the thing that we're all talking about. But let's start with this question first, because I think this is core to whatever topic you are covering. There's this fire hose of information that's coming out of Web3 every day in a way that honestly I have not. I've been working in games and consumer internet for quite a while now, and I have never seen this volume of change happen so quickly. Right, like it's moving faster than I recall, certainly from other industries that I've been a part of in the past. How do you stay on top of the trends? And I know that we can't all be 100% on top of every trend on every chain. I'm building on Solana, so I focus mostly on Solana, and I look at ETH obviously because that's the big, the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room. But you guys, you're doing this for a living essentially, or at least part of your living is covering this thing for real. How do you do it? And I'm talking specifically about a logistical, like, what's your workflow? How are you covering these things? Who are you talking to? What happens on a day-to-day basis so that you feel you are on top of the trends that you care to cover on a daily basis? What tools do you use? What are your workflows? Why don't we start with Chris on this one?
Sure. I can start with trying to stay organized, because I think as creators, that can be something that can be challenging. Shout out to Notion for changing the way that I was working or digesting or organizing information. I think the more you can organize your own personal life, the more you can kind of make sense of things. So I don't really track my personal life any differently than I track work. It's all one thing. If I have to mow the lawn, then that's, I have to weigh that importance during the day as far as like, am I going to mow the lawn, or am I going to write an article about VR tech today? You have to just weigh your options. I think first, the biggest game changer for staying on top of crypto news is having a network of people, or at least knowing people that are engaged in the space, that you trust their intelligence. If you can't trust if you can't trust your friends for that information, then you need to have people in the space that you can trust with that. Finding newsletters that you think are reliable and believable. Thomas and I were talking about this yesterday. Like, when I read New York Times op-eds, I know that they're probably not going to be horrible. I mean, I might disagree with parts of them, but like, there's no difference in this space. You need to be able to find websites like Decrypt, or some sort of newsletter that you're into, or a Discord where they organize information. Don't just be like hunting on websites for what to look for, because then you're just wasting your time. Trust other smart people that spend their time organizing information. Get that information. Ideally, it just depends on how like bleeding edge you want it to be, because ultimately, if it is super duper important, you're going to find out about it from either one of your friends or one of the many newsletters that's going to cover it. It's going to come up. Will you miss things? You absolutely will. But I'm a firm believer in that in 5 years, we'll have forgotten a lot of the day-to-day stuff that had happened, and things that'll be ultimately more important will be just the things that were obviously the top news of the time. Ideally, or maybe even those things won't be important anymore. So, that's my takeaway for like how to discern things. It's just like, find newsletters or find people that you can trust to organize that information, and don't be overwhelmed. Take one article one at a time, slow down. Like my suggestion is to slow down with information. If you can really get like one thing and one solid takeaway then per day, then that adds up over a period of time. But sometimes people are so quick to read a million different things and just push content out. To your point, that there wasn't a lot of, sometimes there's not a lot of original writing. It's a lot of just redigestion, taking things that were said and then re-saying them into organized newsletters. And I knew with my writing, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to try to like sit with something. So if it takes 2 weeks to sit with it, then that's how long it took. Maybe eventually it'll be faster. I'm not doing this full time, so I don't have the luxury of an 8-hour workday dedicated solely to writing and reading. But, and then only that, just like organizing your energy per day. And Thomas will probably get into that, how we try to find the best time of the day that we think we're most creative and most productive, and allocate that towards writing, because there is a serious and substantial drop off for wasting your time and attempting to write at 10 p.m. if that's not if that's not your zone. If that's not your Q zone, you're going to be just sitting there feeling like, why am I so stupid? It's like you're not. You just should have written this 8 hours ago. So those are my primary takeaways. Slow down, drink some water, get some rest, and don't freak out if you miss some of the news, because most of this won't matter in 5 years.
Yeah, I actually have a follow-on question. We're not going to get into this now because we want to hear from Thomas and what his workflow is. But that's always a big question in my mind. If you're on crypto Twitter, everything seems so consequential. It's so important. It's so dramatic. It's so like, oh my God, the world is coming to an end. Like, our NFT's over. And it's one of those things where, like, how much does it really matter? So we're going to get into that in a second. But before we do that, let's talk to Thomas a little bit about his workflow and how he chooses what to do. Because again, your newsletter is quite different to Chris's. Chris's is much more, you alluded to this, Chris, like you'll sit on something for 2 weeks, you'll go deep, you'll write 5,000 words on it. TPan, you're like daily, it's a fire hose of news from you as well. It's 1,000 words, usually, maybe sometimes a little bit more. And it's more like, here's what's happening right now. Whereas Chris's is much more, hey, I'm going to go deep on a subject. And again, we've actually got some conversation that we're going to have on that in a bit. But TPan, what's your workflow? How do you make sense of what's going on with the fire hose that's coming at us every single day in Web3?
First of all, how dare you guys say it doesn't matter? All this matters. Royalties, creators, the culture, decentralization, everything's getting centralized. Meta is taking over. Totally kidding. Chris has amazing points. And I think I appreciate what he shared, because I think I myself can at least take a couple of those nuggets and lean into that a little bit more. And I wouldn't say my process or daily routine is completely different, but because I am able to spend a little bit more time from the absorption of content, the absorption of the volume of content, I do have a somewhat different approach. The way I break out my day in the mornings, I've always maintained my morning routine, even during COVID, even after COVID, prior to COVID, where I work out, I sort of just catch up on high level things with even just personal interests outside of Web3, just catching up on the news, tech, etc. And now I incorporate Web3. And as I mentioned, the primary platforms being Twitter and Discord. And for Twitter, it's all about signal. It's all about who you follow and the quality of the content that comes from that. And naturally, Twitter being a social media platform, having algorithms, they also can pick up what you like, what the people you follow are retweeting. So it's really important to a degree. And if you need to, create a separate Twitter account for it, right? Because if you have personal interests and all those things, if you want a more focused news feed, so to say, or feed of Web3 related content, do what you need to do to curate that. And you could create lists of individuals you follow and things like that. So create a more curated feed is what I would recommend. On the Discord side, there are certain groups, whether they're alpha groups, which is like specific closed gated groups where you might have to purchase an NFT to be a part of and you get specific types of information, or just groups of friends, like what Chris said, where there's higher signal and quality of that signal, which is important. I am fortunate to be a part of a alpha group, which is, paid and things like that. I was a very early member, so I actually got the membership for free way back in, last year. But what they do is they actually have a couple of Discord bots, a news bot that sort of pulls only from 2 accounts. One is called Lucky Trader, which is more NFT specific and has like general headlines in the NFT space. And the other one is Blockworks, where it's more Web3 crypto specific news headlines. From those two Twitter accounts, and then that's all that feed is. So I actually use that feed to really help me just understand what are the headlines in those two respective worlds, and that helps me to just feel comfortable. If I did nothing else that day from on Twitter or whatever, generally they would cover 80 to 90% of the news from a geopolitical standpoint, from a general crypto standpoint, from an NFT standpoint, etc. From an organization standpoint, I'm simple. I just use Trello. And I sort of have separate folders of just all the different newsletters, including Chris's and other folks. I'm sure we'll get later into the podcast about like recommendations of people to follow and read. But I'll be honest, that list is piling up. The inbox is piling up in regards to all those unread things. And I'm coming to terms with that. The number of messages and DMs I'm getting from people, some legitimate, some I had to figure out if they're legitimate or not, that's piling up as well. And I'm traditionally I'm a yes person and I love being a yes person, but it's time to start saying no. And what's nice is people actually understand generally understand like, hey, they're not responding, they're busy, but I do try to batch those things together, whether it's consuming content or, responding to people. And the last thing I would say is, in regards to the consumption of this information, I bunch the shorter bits or like the quick updates from Discord or the Twitter feed in the morning more so and during the day. And at night, I save more of that time because it's quieter, there's less noise for the longer reads. So I intentionally save that because there's nothing really else bothering me and the craziness of the day.
Awesome. Yeah, what's interesting to me is, as I'm listening to both of you, we all have similar approaches, but we're all very different in how we consume our news. Our listenership for this podcast, are kind of leaders in Web3, people coming from Web2 into Web3. And this is why I thought this episode would be really important and interesting to the audience, because in my opinion, there is no other way to actually get this information other than to just dive right in. You kind of have to get in there. You have to have your wallet. You've got to go on the different chains. You've got to buy some NFTs. You've got to follow certain accounts on Twitter and see what's going on because, for better or for worse, top of funnel is still crypto Twitter. And then, the action, the kind of the insights, the alpha happens in the discourse, right? And we're going to get into that in a second. But what to me is interesting about trying to cover this space, trying to build in this space, trying to understand what's going on in this Web3 space is the only way to get there is to actually consume the culture, become a part of that culture in a way that you can maybe get away with in other industries. You don't necessarily have to like dive right into sneaker culture to, maybe that's a bad example. You probably do have to dive into sneaker culture.
I can attest to that. Yeah, you sort of need to dive in.
Right. But more so in Web3 than in almost any other space that I've been a part of in my professional career, it is one where you kind of have to go in there and you got to drink the Kool-Aid and you got to be in there to actually understand what's going on. To that end, my next question, we're gonna get into the creator royalties piece because that's incredibly topical. It's in the news right now. Magic Eden, which is the biggest NFT marketplace on Solana, made the decision last Friday, I think, so just a few days ago, to make paying creator royalties optional. I think a lot of people actually thought that creator royalties were baked into the smart contract. Well, actually, you can get around it. And some other smaller marketplaces had been taking market share from Magic Eden by doing just that, by saying, hey, don't need to pay the creator royalties. When Magic Eden made the call on Friday to say, hey, creator royalties are optional, you don't have to pay them, change the UI, change the experience for buyers and for sellers, firestorm. Again, super consequential, at least according to Twitter. And it's kind of split the world of NFTs and Web3 into two fields. One is, well, it's about time that we change the meta here. Like, why are creator royalties the thing, the only way that revenue is generated by these projects? Come up with different models. To the other extreme, which is, how dare you? Like, this is literally breach of contract. It should be baked into the smart contract at the protocol level. Creators are the lifeblood of this space of Web3. How can we not be paying them the royalties that they've asked for? And I'm very curious to hear your guys' thoughts. I actually haven't seen either of you cover this yet, probably because it's so hot off the press. But I want to hear some thoughts on how consequential is this really? How are you guys planning on covering it? And where does it go from here? Magic Eden has said this is temporary. This is just for the next month. They've also cut their own platform royalties to 0% from the usual 2%. How do you put the genie back in the box, or do you? Where does this go from here?
Yeah, I can open up with this. Nico, you said, neither of you have covered it. I mean, this, if anything, probably if I wanted to cover it, I should have covered it yesterday, being the following Monday, and I write 5 days a week. That said, I wrote about Azuki, and they're doing some very interesting stuff. But yeah, it's very complex because I personally am someone that tries to see the multiple angles of any situation. I've, in previous jobs, and people have given me, made comments like, Thomas, you're very diplomatic, or you're like very level-headed when you sort of look at, potentially a controversial topic. And I don't know exactly why I'm this type of person, but I do see all the sides. This is a multidimensional monster. I think it's, pretty short-sighted. And I do get why people see it as like black or white, but the reality is a lot of this stuff is gray area, right? When you think about regulation, when you think about, 10K PFP projects, when you think about royalties, when you think about any sort of topic in this space, the playbooks are being written. Yes, NFTs have, technically been around for, 5-7 years, but, they've only really hit some level, like very early versions of mainstream only in the past 18 to 24 months. So a lot of things are still being figured out. And I think, to your point, a lot of people assume that from a protocol or like some fundamental level, royalties were like baked into contracts. I didn't know that either till like a few months ago when I learned from Zeneca, who's a pretty well-respected individual, big name in the space, particularly on the Ethereum side and with NFTs. But, he shared his story that he only relatively recently learned that, this is not on that level. This is something that's optional. The marketplaces help facilitate that. So I think there's a lot to be unfolded here. And as crappy as it might be for the creators, and as interesting and beneficial it might be for someone that focuses on flipping for a living or whatever, I think my take is there's a lot of known unknowns, right, in this regard, and unknowns in the next days, weeks, and months. From a Magic Eden standpoint, this is 3-4 days old. From an industry standpoint, this is like, in terms of a larger understanding that this is a new way of thinking about royalties, revenue, ways of operating. This is probably, a couple months old. And the first time I heard about it and the first time I heard rumblings here was actually from a different marketplace called SudoSwap, focused more on the Ethereum side. That was when I learned, like, holy crap, like this is not a contract level, attribute, so to say. So I think what's happening, what I see is definitely, understandably, a lot of creators are upset at this because they had that same sort of understanding that this is a new way for revenue, for them to be rewarded and compensated from traditional models where they weren't, but now that's being taken away from them. So I understand the anger, the frustration. On the other hand, I think it's important to understand that, to a degree, we're all about decentralization, or that's one of the big tenets of the space. And this is, to a degree, a reality of decentralization, right? So I think thematically, I think about, like, you can't always have your cake and eat it too, right? There's a lot of cognitive dissonance if you really take a step back and think about the space. Like, people want, like, everything should be decentralized, everything should be like self-custody. It's like, well, if you want the next billion people to onboard, and we know that the average person is probably, not the smartest people in the world, like, we actually should have, custodial wallets, and we should have centralized ecosystem to support those, 900 million out of the billion that they forget their passwords all the time. Like, you expect them to remember their seed phrase and to write it down, even though that's like one of the most important things in the space. So when it comes to royalties, education and understanding the space is important. And the reality that there's always going to be people or actors, maybe not even bad actors, that are just going to find different ways around certain corners, right? And it's relatively recent that this, corner has been cut. And what I'm excited to see is, how do creators respond to this? Have creators in the past who actually knew about this the whole time, how have they approached this, right? Some artists, what they say is they actually hold back a portion of the mint. I can't forget who, I can't remember who off the top of my head, but there are creators who have done larger editions and they hold 10 or 20% of the mint. So the incentives are mutually aligned. So when it comes to that point, it's important to think about mutually aligned incentives, right? It's important to think about your holder base, the quality of your holder base, the persona of your holder base, right? Because the reality is someone's always going to try to cut corners. So how can you actually get them on your side and to say, oh my gosh, like, this person's awesome. Like, I actually want to pay them in return, right? And the other thing to take note of is, on a macro level, we're in a bear market. So when it comes to a bear market, everyone's looking out for themselves. No matter what people say, like, people have to put food on the table, and it's harder to do that. In a bull market, chances are a lot of those people who were flipping and were like doing it on, marketplaces where there was 0% royalty. Now they're like, yeah, I could give 5%, to the creator because I'm up 3x, right? Like, what's 5% when I'm up 300% or 400%? So that's just something to take note of. And the other thing is, whether it's creator royalties or something else, it's always going to be whack-a-mole, right? Let's say that creator royalties get solved, so to say, from a industry or sort of from like a revenue solution standpoint. There's going to be a next thing. I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be like, well, these hacks are going crazy, and they found a loophole. So there's going to be maybe ethical or sort of moral things to consider. The last thing I would say is, I think we're already seeing creative solutions. There is a developer, his name is Cygaar, Cygaar, I believe, _dev on Twitter. He is actually one of the lead devs or one of the main engineering folks at Azuki. He's always been a fan of creating public sort of tools for other developers and creators in the space. And he's been creating contracts, just more for fun and also testing because it's sort of the zeitgeist and like the hot topic, to your point. But he's like, hey, I created a contract where you could customize which marketplaces are sort of blacklisted from trading. Other potential solutions are, because this is on the blockchain, because there's a level of transparency here, creators can sort of think through, okay, how do I reward individuals or holders or traders or flippers that have done so in a way on marketplaces where I get a percentage of the royalty? So it's all about adjusting the incentives, adjusting sort of the way things work. And there's a beauty and creativity that's going to happen from that.
Yes, a lot of good stuff there. I made some notes here. I think one of the things that to me is the most interesting in what you just said there, again, innovation is going to happen, right? It's just kind of, the space is moving fast. It has to move fast. There's going to be changes. That's the one thing that's for certain. It's going to change, right? But one of the things that you said, which resonates strongly with me, is this notion of aligning the revenue model with the project's kind of business model, so to speak, or service model. And that's something that I've been noodling on certainly over the last weekend, but really in general, which is like, hey, we've had this creator royalty has been, so there's mint and then there's creator royalty. And that's really been it so far. There haven't really been any other innovation around the revenue models. In my opinion, yes, it's painful for the creators in the short term. The ones that were counting on the royalties, they're going to feel the pinch. At the same time, I feel like we've been overdue some level of innovation around matching the revenue model to the service model or the business model of the particular projects. For gaming, it's pretty obvious. There's a lot of analogies from Web2 and kind of traditional air quotes gaming, whether it be free to play or console based or what have you. I think for a lot of NFT projects that are have a less obvious analogy to something from Web2 or from in real life IRL, it's going to take more effort to figure out what those revenue models are to match the product model. Chris, definitely interested in hearing your take on this as well. In particular, because you do this incredible job of covering Web2 brands, diving into Web3. I have to believe you have some thoughts on the analogy of exactly this, which is like matching the revenue model from Web2 to something new and interesting and innovative in Web3. How are you seeing this kind of creator royalty kerfuffle that's blowing up right now, evolving going forward?
Yeah, I think long term it's going to be okay. If this is an experiment that explodes in our collective faces, then that's exactly what it'll be. And maybe this is the beginning of the end for Magic Eden, and people will move to Hades Swap or some other places to buy NFTs. I mean, the platforms aren't that different, and most of the sites just look like copy paste versions of OpenSea. So, not worried about it at all, because if there's enough of a backlash, then the community will change. We can't expect for things to be static with crypto and with Web3, and that's part of the reasons why it's so enjoyable. And when we know that like total secondary sales for NFTs over the last 5 months have been falling, we're in a crypto winter. Like, we need to find new ways to reevaluate how to survive. So, removing the fees from the platform has already led to a significant increase in like wash trading on the platform. So like that's the practice of like trading assets between wallet addresses owned by the same person or party. That's bad. And some people think that this change was made on Magic Eden to artificially increase NFT trading volume, to give the impression that it's more highly sought after than it actually is, which is deceptive. It'll deceive unwitting buyers to pay inflated prices for NFTs. That's bad. So not to mention that, there are other marketplaces that have been eating into the total market share for Magic Eden on the whole. So maybe they offer more competitive fee structures. So maybe this is the reason for the change. It was not, the people that are running these platforms didn't take this lightly. And so it was a decision that like, it's kind of like, once you remove tipping, do we want tipping to come back? I think we go out to eat. It's like, oh, just 15, 20, every time you go out to eat, it's $18 more. Is the same kind of mentality going to happen where tipping becomes optional and creator fees become this optional thing where like, oh, I can't believe you bought that and didn't give 10% to the creator, and maybe the culture around that will change in some way. I think we're just going to have to see how people respond. But I mean, the issues become so prevalent that OpenSea even announced that they're going to, temporarily block some Solana collections from top and trending to avoid gamifying or gaming the numbers artificially. So like, it kind of goes back to the whole question of like, how long is the bear market going to last? Like, is this sustainable long term? Once you remove something like this, will people be stoked that it's gone and start trading on places that have less cost? Because if I can buy an NFT for the same NFT for $200, who cares what marketplace I purchased it on? And as far as like brands go, so many brands entered from Web 2 to Web 3. You just refer to Web 2 as just a traditional company that has a social media strategy. And just as absurd as it would have been to have attempted a few years ago to have had advertisements on TikTok, now it's like having stuff on Web3 is just like, well, duh. But like, one of the biggest reasons brands are entering was like, oh, we get like 10%, we get 15%. People are going to buy and trade these things, and we're going to make all this money doing that. So find new ways to offer utility incentives for people to purchase the collections. Like, I think it's a good thing. Let it explode again. Every time bad things happen, better stuff happens later. So, like hacks and things like, yeah, they suck, but then it means the platform will eventually be more secure. It's a sad nature of in this code world where, things are protean, they will change. So you have to be like expecting that. Brands have to adapt. If they're not going to be willing to adapt, then they, are just going to be busy on Snapchat and Instagram and having failing social media accounts and stuff like it. People have to change. So I'm excited to see what'll happen. Maybe a new platform will pop up with different types of ways to offer utility. I think people become way more creative when they have more constrictions. So the more restrictions, the better. Let's see where this goes.
Yeah, I think the big question in my mind is always, so I tend to agree with both of your takes on this. Adversity breeds innovation, especially in the bear market. The big question in my mind is always, is it 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or is it 1 step forward, 2 steps back? These hacks, these setbacks, these adversities, they can have the chilling effect of either slowing or downright stopping the flow of the mass market to Web3. My last episode that I recorded with John Oswald from Gala Games was all about how do we onboard the mass market to Web3, given all the friction, which we already know about, but also all the negativity in the news and all the drama, and it's almost like a self-inflicted wound when we see some of these things happening. It just feels like, well, why would somebody who is not already red-pilled into Web3 actually go to the effort of getting these wallets when they know, like, well, I know there's these hacks and I know that my things aren't safe and there's no takebacks. I can't get, it's not like I can go to my bank and I have a, transaction that I can reverse if there's fraud or if I make a mistake or whatever. So I think that to me is always the big question. Is it 2 steps forward, 1 step back, which is fine. We're moving the space forward, and we're learning from the mistakes that we make collectively as an industry, or is it actually just 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and we're harming the cause of building Web3, which I think I speak for the three of us, where we believe that there are incredibly valuable and interesting things that Web3 can bring in a variety of ways to different industries. So great thoughts. We're going to move on from that because, and by the way, there's actually a great episode I just listened to last night, Unchained, the Unchained podcast. Really, really good episode last night. If anybody hasn't listened to it, it's all about the creator royalties situation. They actually have one of the founders of Magic Eden on the show to talk about that issue. So you get it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, in terms of why they did what they did. And so I won't steal their thunder. You can go and download that episode of Unchained. Let's move topics. It's aligned with what we just talked about, but it's more at the higher level. Again, this is specifically for Thomas here. So I think one of the things that I see in your writing that I find particularly interesting is that you almost obsess over the little details. You go into like the weeds, and I love that because I think sometimes those little details are what makes all the difference. But other times I'm not sure they do. So I'm super curious to hear. Let me give you an example. So I think in a recent newsletter, you paid attention to a project where the founder of the project or founders of the project were retweeting announcements. And you commented on this as a strategy. And I find it really interesting because who knows how the Twitter algorithm works. And obviously a lot of the action for NFTs and Web3 happens on crypto Twitter. And so I found it really interesting that you commented on it. And you do this all the time with different projects, whether it's the onboarding flow or how people get, engage in Discord channel strategy. Like you will literally comment on all of the little things. And I love personally reading about those because even if I don't actually adopt some of those or all of those tactics, I find it interesting intellectually and stimulating to think about them and say, okay, well, I wonder how much it drives. So why and how do you pick up on these little things? And how often do you actually find that they are driving meaningful change or meaningful metrics for these particular projects? How do you actually validate where you're, what I presume are initially thought exercises? How do you actually validate whether they're right or wrong, or whether there's a positive or negative impact to these little observations that you make? Your newsletter in particular is absolutely, of all the stuff I read, definitely goes the deepest into the weeds on some of these things, which I really do appreciate, honestly do appreciate. So that's definitely something that TPan's newsletter calls out. Anyway, talk to me about this.
Yeah,
this is super fascinating to me.
Yeah, and yeah, Niko, I appreciate it. I think that's a great observation of my observations, right? Thinking thematically about the things I write about, like how I write about it. Generally, I sort of have 3 types of writing, which is like shorts, thoughts, and dives. That said, shorts and thoughts sort of overlap in the sense that ideally my shorts are truly short, like an under 5-minute read, which most of the time they aren't. Thoughts are usually there's multiple topics I talk about. They're not necessarily related. It's just like, hey, a lot happens in 24 hours, obviously, in this space. So, here's some top of mind things. And the dives are more focused on like one product, one company, one theme or framework I've thought about or sort of written about. So typically, this more leans on the thoughts or short side of things, like, hey, found this really interesting thing. Like, here's to a degree why, and I'm making certain assumptions, like why this is interesting from my point of view, why this is something you should just think about or consider. So to answer the question, my background's in growth, my background's in marketing. So it sort of is a name of the game. I think a lot of people in growth, they share a lot of sort of nuggets from like talks to like what they're seeing. There's so many different tools and websites. For example, I come from the mobile space, like the mobile app space specifically. And there's so many websites actually, even from like a UI UX standpoint, where they break down step by step every single screen, for the onboarding of every single major app in the space, whether it's Noom, Calm, the top mobile games to, Facebook's onboarding process and things like that. So I think to a degree that was just through repetition. I went to the growth gym every day for 10 years and I was like, whoa, I really enjoy reverse engineering. I really enjoy if I were in their shoes, like, what am I trying to test? Why are they asking these questions in a user research survey? And like, just really making certain sort of assumptions to a degree, but inferences about like what they're trying to do. So with Magic Eden, so I'm doing this on the fly. I haven't done this thought exercise, but like, what are they trying to do? Right? Magic Eden is a 3-sided marketplace. Whoa, they are? Well, they have creators, they have consumers or buyers of the created NFTs, and they also have the developer ecosystem, believe it or not. Right. So this is actually a 3-sided marketplace. And what they're actually straining right now is the relationship with the creators. So going back to, how I think about this, I think additionally, I just always love like diving into details, catching things that people don't catch and like sharing that with a broader audience. And to your point, Niko, I think it's important for my audience. And I think they, indirectly already do this. Like they find it very interesting, but they also have a level-headedness of like, oh, if TPan talks about it, it's interesting. Let me poke in, maybe click on the link and try it myself or observe what he's observing. But like that doesn't apply to me. What I'm trying to say with all the things I point out is not that you should try it, but this is interesting. That might apply to you in a year from now. That might never apply to you. But like, just take note of this because maybe this becomes something where there's pattern recognition and I will call that out in my writing. And maybe you should take a closer look at it at a certain point. The other sort of, comp for this is like feedback, right? We're all builders, we're all professionals, and we get feedback all the time. Whether, Niko, you're talking to investors about like, hey, what do you think about what we're doing right now? What are you seeing in the space? And investors are going to be investors. They always have an opinion and like, it's very valuable opinions. For me, I have a lot of people, who say like, hey, I like this, I like that, or whatever. And some of it's very valuable and you truly take it to heart. And some of the feedback, a lot of the feedback, you sort of take note of, but to a degree, you appreciate it and you acknowledge it, but then you ignore it, right? Because like you have a vision, you have something that you're focused on that maybe sometimes people just don't have the full context on. So what I'll also finish the question with my answer with is one thing that sort of popped up in my head when I was like thinking about the questions was this project called Moonsault. Moonsault is basically a version of NBA Top Shot by WWE. And when I came across that, because I probably saw a headline somewhere or followed a Twitter account, which actually mentioned it. It was actually, it was a Twitter account called The First Mint. They're pretty OG. They came from the Top Shot days and built a sort of media brand since then to cover more sports related and dapper related products, among other things. I was like, whoa, WWE's coming in, the Moonsault, let me check it out. And I was like, oh, interesting. This is basically a version of Top Shot. Who's running this? Because like clearly the IP licensing is WWE. I doubt WWE has like a Web3 arm. So I was like, typically, copyrights, trademarks, like, all those, things are in the fine print at the bottom. So I scroll down to the bottom. I'm like, okay, there's no real mention, outside of the standard stuff. This is WWE, but I know it's not really WWE to a degree. So let me look at the TNCs and the privacy policy, right? Because that's sometimes where you get to see the DBAs, like who's the real business beside it, but like behind the thing, behind the product, who's building it. And I found a company called Blockchain Creative Labs. So I Googled Blockchain Creative Labs. Let's see what that is. BCL.xyz, I believe. And lo and behold, that is Fox Entertainment's tech and Web3 arm. So I was like, what's this? And then went on their website. They have a lot more that they're doing besides WWE, which is apparently, and I might be wrong, so don't quote me, but like a Fox Entertainment property of sorts. So they have the licensing rights of some degree. They're doing US Football League. They're doing The Masked Singer, which I used to watch feverishly with my fiance. They're doing Crapopolis, which is by one of the co-founders of Rick and Morty. So they're testing a lot of interesting things. So that's just the way I operate. I'm not encouraging everyone to be like, oh, let me look at the TNCs of every single like product, Web3 product. But that's sort of the way I operate. And that's how I'm able to find interesting details that your average person sort of just glosses over, which is totally understandable.
Yeah, I mean, as ex-Zynga, where I got my start in game development, one of the things that we would do, I think perhaps to a fault, ultimately, was we would absolutely go and analyze and reverse engineer, top games or interesting products, or FTUE flows, first time user experience flows, or payer conversion flows, or things like that. And that's why I appreciate your takes here, because sometimes it's those little details that actually have a really big impact on how a product functions. And it's only through looking at the little details and actually analyzing the data and then following through on, okay, I have a thesis, this is interesting, I'm going to look at this, and then I'm going to measure what it actually does. Can you actually, truly observe what these things are doing? So to anybody, I would encourage anybody building in Web3, in my opinion, no detail is too small. And there is no vertical that you shouldn't look at when you're, whether you're building games or DeFi or whatever. We're all figuring the space out, and there's a lot of learning that can happen from looking at some of the smaller details and the bigger picture. We're going to get to that in a second, Chris, because that's why we have you on the show as well, because you're a great counterpoint to TPan. Like, he goes into the weeds, looks at like the individual feature level stuff. You do much more of a high level, hey, here's a historical take. And anyway, we're going to get to that in a second. But to me, the value of analyzing any Web3 project, whether it be gaming or otherwise, is trying to figure out what's working and what's not, and what's resonating with consumers and what's not, whether it be Twitter strategy, Discord strategy, or product strategy, revenue models, whatever. There's no detail too small that isn't up for debate and isn't up for, hey, let's rethink this. Let's do this better than the other guy. Let's do this better than we're doing it in Web 2 or traditional industries that have analogies in Web 3. Okay. With that, that's a perfect segue into Chris. So your writing, I've alluded to this already, your writing is much, much deeper, which is not to say that TPan doesn't, again, incredibly valuable, but your writing is deliberately, I think, quite different. Thomas is writing maybe 1,000 words each, again, 5 days a week. Yours is less frequent, but you do 5,000 plus words. You do historical deep dives. You did a piece on Disney's Web3 strategy, which I found absolutely fascinating. Highly recommend it to anybody. Really interesting. You had literally a page's worth of footnotes and links out. You went all the way back to the 1960s and Walt Disney's original vision for the Epcot Center and what that was going to be. But then you tie it all back together at the end to, hey, here's what Disney's doing in Web3. Here's their strategy. I'm not going to, give away your content here, but how do you decide what topics to cover? Again, a lot of your writing goes into brands, existing brands, kind of touching on Web3, and it's not just like, oh, I observed that Disney's doing a Web3 thing. It's more like, no, like here's how it ties deeply to their actual brand strategy, and certainly convincing to me. I'm compelled by your arguments. What makes you be interested in what Web 2 brands are doing in Web 3? Why does it even matter what Web 2 brands are doing in Web 3? Doesn't the innovation all happen at the startup level? Isn't it all about web first crypto native founders, right? Throw it to you, Chris. Like what's going on with Web 2 brands and Web 3? Why does it even matter?
Yeah, why does it matter when they're going to end up emulating the Web3 startups that are making original cool content? I think at first I was writing it to get a better understanding of like where were things, where are they heading, and where do I think they're going to be like soon. I did a deep dive on Adidas where I talked about like, well, how has Adidas used the internet and the web in general over the last 20 years, and are they typically brands you can kind of see it from far away. They're going to be more pioneers. In the case of Disney, they were pioneering. They were the definition of the pioneers. Like they literally invented theme parks. Before it was just an amusement park where you just go and there's rides. Like, no, we're going to make it this immersive thing. And how does that tie into mixed reality, where you can see the clear parallels where we're going to take that idea and move it. And then for me, the big thing, and the reason why my Substack is called Spatial Awareness, was because for me, I couldn't help but keep zooming out and being like, Web3 is important, but Web3 will come to be a part of a larger whole that involves the internet in a multitude of different ways, with IoT devices, extended reality, and how is the world going to look in 30 years? Like, are we going to be referring to Web3 the way we are? It was largely a marketing term to begin with. So, so why do I pick the brands that I pick? I think usually I pick them because they're doing something right. In the case of like Coca-Cola, there were things that I felt like they weren't doing well, or at least I didn't realize I didn't like it until I had already written like 80% of the article. So I was like, okay, I had to finish it, even if I don't like how this is working. But that's good. As Frank Zappa might say, my music taste is based on what I hate. And then I just kind of go from there. So like you learn a lot about brands by being like, I hate that. Like I really don't like what you did, but why do I hate it so much? But to be fair, most of my articles are based around like, what are brands doing really well and how do things tie into each other? I usually pick topics that I find interesting, and then I'll kind of throw the idea around to a few people that I know. Sometimes I'll pick Web3. I'll talk to a number of people before releasing an article. In the case of my recent article involving Byzantine fault tolerances, I couldn't find anyone that was interested in reading that article, because it was like, well, why is our distributed tokenized future? Why does Web3 rely on fault tolerance? And people are like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So that's an example of a bad article, because not that I like it. Please read it. It's enjoyable, and I think it's interesting for understanding why are fault tolerances is important. But it needs to be applicable to people's lives. It needs to be applicable to like work. And more importantly, if you're working somewhere, how can we like take these ideas and actually make them actionable? So for some of my articles, like for token gating, signing with Ethereum, loyalty in 2022, like that's the article name. Like, how can brands use NFTs to unlock new experiences and create brand loyalty? Like a problem that I've seen with a lot of articles online was just like, you'd get those nuggets if you read like 30 articles and be like, oh, now I'm seeing a clearer picture of how brands are doing this. I was like, I need a place to organize this information for myself, for my own benefit. So if somebody asks me, where's brand loyalty in 2022? I can be like, here's where it is, and here's a few examples of why I like it. So picking subjects that are interesting and fun. And then I use my girlfriend as a good example. I'm like, does that sound like an article you would read? Because the bar is extremely high for being like, okay, in the case of Disney, it was like, okay, you can meet people that don't like Disney, but I don't think I've met too many people who like absolutely hate Disney World. Like, I don't think I've ever met anyone who was like, I hate Disney World. That's not possible. So good example of picking something, I try to pick stuff that like, you might not love Adidas, but you probably don't like actively hate Adidas. The same thing with Nike, like unless you have some weird vendetta against shoe brands, I don't know. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I did another report on the state of NFT ticketing because I kept being asked at work and, just by people like, well, how are people ticketing things? Like, what are the best things for this? I'm like, I should just write an article that like sums all this up because it's driving me crazy. So now when people ask, well, where's NFT ticketing in 2022? I'm like, oh, I thought the same thing. That's why I made an article about it. So that we'll dive into. There's a lot of different ways to cut the cake. There are a lot of different right answers to things. A lot of things are better than other things. So comparing and contrasting things. For Thomas's work, it's great to see daily content where I can learn about something. Like yesterday, you covered PBTs, physical backed tokens, and understanding the future of Figitals and like what a Figital marketplace might look like in the future and how that differs from a purely digital marketplace. There's a lot of parallels to that, but daily stuff like that will lead into like, well, how can I have an article that dives into what are the future of like Ethereum-based tokens? Are we going to have like SBTs, PBTs, PB&Js? No, it's just like continuing on and on and on. But like PBTs is a great example of like, after, a few weeks of Thomas's writing, that's an example of an article where I would want to dig into that a lot and like learn, like, where is this going to go? How does it really work? How are you going to like keep it so a physical item actually has a code? And then you get into like just like warehouse management and like actually storing an item and like how are you going to like make sure it's actually the item that you're saying that it is. And that's interesting. So go find interesting things first. I think we both, Thomas and I both write things that we think are fascinating. So and we do write differently, but it was not intentional. It was not intentional at all.
That's honestly why I wanted both of you on the show, because you could not be more different in your styles and in your approach. And yet I find both of your writing to be incredibly valuable in just very different ways, in highlighting all of the innovation that's happening, whether it be mostly in Thomas's case, crypto native startups, who are like thinking things from first principles, to, in your writing, Chris, Web2 brands that are entering Web3 with huge budgets, and massive resources at their disposal in a way that, crypto native startups don't. And I think that's where I find it as a game dev, as a game developer, operator in the space, I find it really valuable to see the different approaches and the different types of thinking that's happening around what is possible in Web3 and what does Web3 even mean. In Web3, certainly I, as a game dev, I find it quite painful, to put it mildly, right now, because none of these problems is really solved. A lot of these picks and shovels have yet to be built, and these solutions have yet to be offered by different service providers and companies. So my final substantive question to you guys is, what are you seeing in this space? Who is doing the best work covering and understanding these things? Why don't we start with you, TPan, because I just called you out on the Safari referral. How are you finding these companies? How are you covering them? And who's doing interesting work in this space?
There's no great answer to be first and foremost. I will give a shout out to Safari and Jump. So Safari spelled with a Y instead of an I, led by Justin Vogel, and he has a couple of co-founders. They're a great sort of community. They are a apply first community of growth leaders in the space. An example, a comp from my mobile days, it reminds me of to a degree, is like Mobile Dev Memo by Eric Seufert. You had to apply for that. You really have some of the smarter folks or the more leaned in folks in the mobile space sort of actively chatting, and you see those names continue to pop up. A version of that's happening in Safari. And one thing that happened in the past few weeks, where Justin and his team at Safari were actively sharing, and then they just put out the sort of inaugural version of this, was they created a Web3 growth ecosystem map. So we've seen this in a lot of other Web2 spaces, or like companies like G2 create certain, charts or, versions of this too. But he created a version specifically for Web3 and Web3 growth. So, SaaS tools, different platforms for X, Y, or Z. And I think the initial version, and probably it's grown since, has like 75 to 100 plus companies that are Web3 specific solutions. The second one I mentioned is Jump, in capital letters, JUMP. It's more for marketers. I think they're at about 2,000-ish members. So like anyone that sort of touches marketing, so like Chris and myself, we actually met through Jump. That's how we got connected in the first place. Definitely check them out. They're also apply to join. Great members. The founder, Jeff, is an awesome guy. We both spoke at a conference last week in San Diego, so it was great catching up with him in person too, and meeting other jumpers in person, and some I've met in the past. So those are a couple of the places where I learn more about what's the latest and greatest, and just people connect with me, and people are like, oh, this guy writes about these companies. He writes about different trends and things going on. He does dives. Like, you should chat with him, or you should subscribe to him.
Awesome. Chris, chance for you to answer that question as well. Picks and shovels. Who's solving the problems? Where are they bubbling up? How are you finding them? And then we'll move on to recommendations from both of you for other sources that we should all be reading to stay on top of these trends.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, to Thomas's point, it's always good to reach out to people in person. I for one was surprised that Thomas was not actually a small blue cat that was writing anonymously on crypto Twitter threads. So that was a shock to meet Thomas. It looked completely different in person.
Surprise.
Different species, apparently. Yeah. He's not a cat.
I know, completely. He's not a feline. Sometimes similar mannerisms on Discord, but that's way off topic. People definitely reach out a lot shout out to Jump again. Thomas and I met there, but some of the best contacts that I've made are people that actually will even reach out to me on Discord or Telegram or Signal or whatever, for different updates for companies that are working at building out different tools. I really think 2023 for big companies using like owner relationship management platforms that are oriented towards Web3 is going to be major, because they, this year and last year, maybe you have a large following or a large collection of people that are now using NFTs that your company had created. Like, how are you supposed to engage with them? So a company like Sale.finance is really cool. It's kind of pivoting and touting itself as the first owner relationship management platform for Web3. So finding ways to, and this kind of ties into gaming, like having play to earn mechanics, engage to earn mechanics, earning, custom sort of tokens or brand tokens for engagement, being able to have exclusives and different advantages from NFTs that are purchased. And then, a good example would be, there's another company called Flaunt.xyz that is really getting into customer loyalty. And that kind of ties in a little bit to, I know Lacoste has recently been experimenting with how can we do like pioneer more loyalty involving Web3. And I think that just looking up Lacoste and what Lacoste is doing with with NFTs is definitely worth checking out. As far as like other companies, it just depends on what your slant is. If you're looking for like development stuff, things are changing quickly. I think, having no code platforms and having things that are a lot easier to use is like the name of the game for sure. DAOs that are looking for different programs and different tech have a different set of requirements for things that they're looking for. If you want to have more of a Jira experience, like using clarity.so is a good example for DAOs. If you're purely concerned about loyalty, maybe hang.xyz is good for you. If you just want to you just want to have token gating for certain content, maybe Mintgate is the way to go. But I really think 2023 is going to be the year, because it has to happen at some point, that more brands are going to be using Web3 based CRMs to connect with users. So there's a lot of protocols that are being developed right now. And especially you can definitely get a vibe for how things are, for how many people are messaging you on LinkedIn being like, I've got this new product. It's like, yeah, you and like 20 other people. So like time will tell what tool reigns supreme.
Yeah. One of the things this reminds me of is, we sign up for a whole bunch of, Web3 tools, and some of them work out, some of them don't, some of them we keep using, some of them we don't. And one thing that just came to my mind is every single one of them, we don't get an invoice for. We get a Discord message from a cat or a monkey or a lion or some animal, and it's like, hey, your monthly subscription is due, or like, hey, you got to pay for this quarter's service, and it's this much in Sol or ETH or USDC or whatever, and there's a wallet address, and it just reminded me, like, to me that's normal, to the average person, to certainly to Web2 brands who are used to doing things a certain way, where you have to have everybody on board into your invoicing system and your CRM solution or whatever. That's madness. We're living not just Wild Wild West, but we're like, we're on another planet here in the Wild Wild West. Okay. So on that note, very quickly for both of you, 2 or 3 resources that are absolutely like your must reads. We're not talking service providers. We're talking, newsletters, Substacks, whatever, Medium blogs. Where are you getting the top 2 or 3 sources of information for what's going on in Web3? It doesn't have to be gaming related, but just what is going on in Web3? What is going on with NFTs? What is going on with this, world of crazy decentralization that we're living in? Where are you getting those nuggets of information from that's most valuable to you? Let's start with you, Chris.
Sure. Great question. Sometimes I'll go rogue and just start looking at random articles online. I think Decrypt is great for curating stuff that's immediately important. I also am subscribed to this thing called Signal, which is top Web3 social headlines, which is powered by Forefront. So that every day they curate 10 to 12 different ideas. Sometimes those are Substacks. So like for today's headlines, number 2 is Gassing the Miracle Machine with Packy McCormick, who is, I was going to mention as being a massive influence for me on Substack.
Similar, but, likewise.
It's usually, it's usually a mixture of things, but typically those. Jump has a great newsletter as well that I would definitely recommend. And I'm trying to think of what else, and without really overextending myself, I think those are the top ones for now. Dig into Signal, and you'll be in a good place, because that's everything that you'd want to look at on a daily basis.
Thank you, Chris. TPan, for you, 2 or 3.
Yeah, I would first give a shout out to Chris's newsletter, Spatial Awareness, because it's not often, but when it comes out, you know it's going to be good. And that's just different for me. So I always appreciate the ones that are less frequent and you just know you should and will read every single piece. Proof is interesting. I just discovered this last week because Sam, who is at Punk9059, was on Rug Radio, and I'll give them a shout out really quickly in a bit. But they have like research reports that are free. So Proof is this like very exclusive 1,000 member club. I think the floor is like 40 ETH to even get in, so not cheap. Obviously, the who's who's. And then 6529, Punk 6529, just like a philosopher, but also just like still anonymous today, 400,000 followers, and he just has great big threads about like almost philosophical topical items. And then lastly, Rug Radio. They have something called the GM Show. It's a Twitter Spaces, so it's really nice because they talk about macro markets, they talk about sort of the NFT markets, and then they always have like a guest, whether it's art, whether it's gaming, whether it's like some other thing in the space. So it's really nice, diverse sort of 60 to 90 minute Twitter Spaces, just to really like, if there's one Twitter Spaces every morning, that's sort of my daily routine.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for those. This has been an incredible set of insights. We're going to try and link as many of the name drops, the resources that you guys have talked about. Obviously, definitely we'll link to yours, your newsletters in the show notes. But that's it for today. Huge thank you to Chris. Huge thank you to Thomas. Incredible insights. I definitely recommend subscribing to both. Again, very different styles, but both very valuable resources about the world of Web3. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.
And of course, a big thank you to all of our listeners. We'll be back next week with more interviews, more insights, more analysis from the weird and wonderful world of Web3. So until next time, friends, stay crypto curious. Feel free to send questions, guest recommendations, and comments to me, Niko. My email is niko@naavik.co. And you can also find me on Twitter @NikoTheFin. DMs always open. Thank you guys, and see you next week.